everybody. Welcome to our Nashville Parthenon virtual symposium. I'm delighted to see so many of you here this evening. My name is Katie Petroli. I am the Director of Education at the Nashville Parthenon. And today I am delighted to share a little bit about our speaker and introduce her and let her take the reins and wow us with her research and scholarship. Before I do that, a reminder, if you have any technical difficulties, please feel free to type them in the chat. I will be monitoring that and helping as best I can throughout. So if you're having any sound issues or video issues, we'd like to know, make sure that you can participate fully. If you have any questions, we encourage discussion and we will have time for questions at the end of the symposium. So please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen or to use the chat button and type your questions as well. And I will be asking them to Dr. Crystal deGregory, who will have time to address questions that come up based on the research she shares tonight. So without further ado, allow me to present Dr. Crystal A. deGregory. We are so excited to have her with us tonight. She's a historian and a storyteller whose research interests include Black higher education and college student activism. She is a research fellow at Middle Tennessee State University Center for Historic Preservation here in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. She has written extensively, both for academic audiences and public scholarship. So we'll have a little treat for that tonight, as well as she's helped us with our Looking Back exhibition, which is now on display in the West Gallery through January 8th. You can find her words on our website and in our exhibition and a panel all about the Negro Building at the Tennessee Centennial Exposition, which we will dive deeper into this evening. She is an alumna of the historic Fisk University, plus she's also earned a Master of Arts and a PhD in history from Vanderbilt University, and she has a Master of Education from Tennessee State University. So please help me welcome Dr. Crystal A. deGregory.
Thank you so much, Katie, for that very warm welcome. Thank you all for tuning in wherever you are. If you are in Nashville or in the surrounding areas and happen to be, I don't want to say a victim, but happen to be an endurer of the current heat wave. I celebrate your forbearance in joining us this evening. The Lord knows it is hot out there. Let me first say that I have no experience whatsoever with centennials, but I do have some experience with a quincentennial as a native of Freeport, Bahamas, when I was just a little girl, about 10 years old. We marked the arrival of Christopher Columbus to San Salvador in the Bahamas. And I remember the excitement and glee. We had specially printed money. We also had exhibits on our school campus. And this is not a very equitable, just or inclusive probably example of what these things ideally should be. But I do remember we had some Indian students of Indian parentage, both parents, and we employed them in the hut that we had built outside as Arawak Indians, and had them cut their bangs forward, like the displays in the book. And so I know a little bit about centennial efforts, and I know a lot about not quite getting them right. So it is my pleasure to join you this evening for the 125th anniversary of the Tennessee Centennial Exhibition and the building of the Negro Building in particular. When I made this post on Facebook, some people were struck, I think, not by the word building, but by the word Negro in front of it. And I had to say to them, you have to consider the tenor of the time. So thank you so much for that very warm welcome, Katie. I do want to say that in an effort to have you understand how important the building of this structure was to Tennesseans of that time, especially Black, but also white, it's important that I start at a little earlier place. I think people on my dissertation committee would be like, yeah, this is like a trend with you. You know, you like to go back, right? But I do hope that you enjoy. In the spring of 1862, Nashville became the first major Confederate city to the Union Army, to fall to the Union Army. As a prize capture of the Union, the city and the state had been a prime target because of the latter's strategic location. And with its seizure, Tennessee became the only Confederate state that came entirely under Union control before the Civil War ended in April 1865. The state's many secessionists took no pride in this distinction. When historian, the late Stephen V. Ash, characterized Union occupation as, quote, a devastating experience for most Tennesseans, he must have been referring to them. Some fled Tennessee for the Deep South, others mounted some measure of largely unsuccessful resistance, while the majority accepted their new and sometimes improved reality, however begrudgingly. But for Unionists in general and enslaved people in particular, the coming of the Union spelled the beginning of better days. In the case of the latter, federal troops were welcomed as both figurative and literal saviors. Ignoring the Union Army's official policy to avoid interfering with slavery, many enslaved people became self-proclaimed and, more importantly, proclaimed to the Union Army camps to which they ran, freed men. The, quote, trickle of runaways that became a flood, end quote, following the emancipationist turn of federal policy, flocked to the Union's, quote, contraband camps, end quote, where they sought food, clothing, shelter, medical care, jobs, and perhaps most remarkably, education. Even those formerly enslaved persons who remained with their former owners in many instances refused to obey orders and demanded wages for their labor. Slave owners, having justified the inhumanity and the brutality of slavery in the American experience, were hardly dumbfounded when those formerly enslaved to them proved neither docile nor contented. The time of a new South, it seemed, had come. By the close of the Civil War, the city had been radically transformed from its former self. Gone were its majestic trees and many of its picturesque homes. Its hills were littered with the refuse of military engagements, and its citizens were forever changed by the viciousness of war. Suddenly transformed from a booming Confederate arsenal to a ghost town, then again to a Union outpost, Nashville had been an especially difficult place to live during and after the war. The movement of so many troops and their supplies made the city a virtual dust bowl during arid summers, like the one we're having now, while winters presented freezing temperatures that covered city streets with sodden mud, making living conditions difficult for all who lived there. Now, because I did not want to bore you to death, I created a PowerPoint for you. So here we go, Civil War era, Nashville, Tennessee, as a Confederate arsenal would be radically transformed by the Civil War and certainly in the years after the Civil War. The changes to the city's geography mirrored the changes in many Nashvillians' attitudes. White city leaders began to push for Nashville's identification as a New South city. As Don Doyle has successfully argued in his 1985 publication, Nashville in the New South. The Nashville Centennial served as an important benchmark for marking the beginnings of Nashville's entrance into the race of emergent New South cities, acknowledging that, quote, nothing else quite tells us so much about a community as the way it interprets its own history, end quote. The Centennial celebration was the city's first major exercise in the delicate balance between Old South romanticism and New South advocacy. But what exactly did New South advocacy mean? Early historians of the American South argued that the moniker was not a reference to a place nor a period in time, but instead served as a rallying cry that separated the, quote, lost cause from the, quote, new cause, and that abandoned Old South traditions of slavery and cotton for the progressive pursuits of industrialization and nationalism. However, in his 1951 seminal work, Origins of the New South, historian C. Van Woodard shirked paradigm, choosing instead to intentionally define the New South in more practical terms of geography, political unity, economic deficiency, and regional peculiarity. Adding several important and nuanced arguments as divergences from Origin's contentions, Howard Rabinowitz's 1992 book, The First New South, concluded that the economic transformation decreed by its boosters never materialized. Further, Rabinowitz demonstrated that their contention of racial progress was to segregate Black Americans from facilities to which they were once completely denied access. Rabinowitz also argued that these realities of the South's inability to secure agricultural and industrial progress can be easily traced back to the structural deficiencies of the pre-Civil War era, namely credit availability, racism, and social conservatism. Now, Rabinowitz's final statement in the book is really the point of the whole book. In it, he says this: the point is not that the first New South was not new, but that it was not new enough. Nevertheless, Black Nashvillians knew all too well the limits of New South rhetoric, just as Blacks across the South knew the limits of the federal government's power to protect them. While Reconstruction in Tennessee had begun during the Civil War, the middle and western regions of the states, where its efforts were concentrated and were largely Confederate and had a long history of slaveholding. The Union's capture of the state and the subsequent leadership of military Governor Andrew Johnson infuriated Confederate sympathizers, as did the election of William G. Brownlow in 1865. While Brownlow had been pro-slavery, he was also decidedly pro-unionist, kind of like, I don't know, Abraham Lincoln, but that's another lecture for another day. The year following his election, Parson Brownlow led Tennessee's ratification of the 14th Amendment, which paved the way for the state to be fully restored to the Union. Now, still angry over the passage of the 1866 Civil Rights Act, which reinforced the rights of citizenship to the freedmen, and the subsequent passage of the supporting acts of 1870 and 1871, also known as the Enforcement and Ku Klux Acts, respectively, which established sanctions against the obstruction of Black suffrage and guaranteed citizenship to the freedmen. Southern whites, as a rule, despised the Civil Rights Acts and viewed them as evidence of the federal government's intrusion into states' affairs. No single group embodied Southern white resentment, as did the Ku Klux Klan, whose Tennessee roots are well known. Founded in 1865 in the little market corner of Pulaski, the county seat of Giles County, Tennessee, the Klan's founders were 6 idle former Confederate soldiers who, at the close of the war, were bored with, quote, enforced inactivity, end quote, argued Stanley Horn in his book, Invisible Empire. But what Horn argues began as, quote, horseplay, end quote, became increasingly violent as it grew in the wake of the radical Republicans' return to power in Congress in 1867. Ex-Confederate resentment made the South rotten ripe for the Klan's growth. As the cradle of the Ku Klux Klan, the spread of Klan dens across Tennessee to the middle and western parts of the state during the 1860s was undoubtedly accelerated by the membership of Confederate General, also disgraced Confederate General, Nathan Bedford Forrest, who, quote, brought prestige and legitimacy to the organization, end quote. Tennessee's KKK dens continued to grow and terrorize Black Tennesseans with their power completely unchecked until 1869, when Governor Brownlow led the push for the Klan's disbandment through the passage of the anti-Ku Klux Klan law. Now, some historians have subsequently noted 1870 to 1873 as years of Klan suppression. But Alan Traley's has noted such claims were imprecise. Even in Tennessee, where the Klan supposedly disbanded in 1869, it by no means disappeared. Night riding and outrages on Negroes continued to take place in the middle and western sections of the state. The violent acts with which the Klan would later become synonymous, including dressing in makeshift robes and hoods made from sheets and pillowcases, accompanied its truest terror. It threatened, exiled, flogged, mutilated, shot, stabbed, and hung Blacks in 9 states in which it was active, including in the state of Tennessee. This was the stage onto which Tennessee was to hold its World Fair to commemorate the 100th anniversary of its joining the Union. Proposed first by Douglas Anderson in a letter to the Chattanooga Times in August 1892, a Tennessee centennial would not only increase patriotism and state pride, it would spur economic growth and encourage competition among its leading cities, including Nashville. Tennesseans were progressive people, contended Anderson, and the fair would attract visitors to the state while educating young Tennesseans about the, quote, glories and wonders, end quote, of Tennessee. Whatever Anderson's hopes were, he would not ultimately decide the fair's fate. In his official history, the Tennessee Centennial's official historian, Herman Justy, wrote of it, whatever motive may have inspired great expositions elsewhere, the one underlying and overshadowing motive of the Tennessee Centennial Exposition was true patriotism, end quote. While the fair's motives are seemingly clear, the pathway to pull it off was not. The realization of any hope for the fair's fruition would have to overcome the panic of 1893, which seized the city's banking industry and the depression that was soon to follow. The following spring, the Centennial Club and the Board of Trade formed a general committee that served as the precursor to the Centennial Company. Rallied by a fiery monologue offered by Tully Brown, the city's white businessmen pledged almost $13,000 in stock. Dubbed Centennial City, The fair was granted its own charter from the Tennessee State Legislature in 1894. Construction began on it just 2 years later, on June 1st, 1896, on the grounds of what is now Nashville Centennial Park. The majority of it would be constructed during the first half of 1897. The Negro Building was no exception, but just how it came to be, however, would involve several additional politics, including most obviously race. But Black Tennesseans had faced additional obstacles that their white enthusiasts did not. In Nashville, there had been little concerted effort to offer the city's Black citizenry with any real equality. The presence of several prominent Black colleges in Nashville, including Fisk University, Tennessee Central College, and its Meharry Medical College offshoot, was owed to Black self-determination and Northern white paternal philanthropy, not to Southern sympathy, much less support. Reformist Democrats had successfully passed some reform legislation that sought to improve Black life, namely the creation of an all-Black fire company in East Nashville and improvements to the city's Black educational offerings. The quote, moment in the sun, end quote, to which W.E.B. Du Bois had referred to the fleeting promises of Reconstruction that were lost on Nashville political operatives with the mayoral election of 1885. Any attempts at meaningful reform that did not offer white progressives the power they too sought meant the return to politics as usual in Nashville, which notably claimed that no Blacks were elected to office in the city between 1885 to 1951. The social and political climate in which Blacks would envision their role in the fair and make those desires known to their white counterparts was not a welcomed one. As early as 1895, Blacks began their push for the Centennial to have both a Negro Building and a Negro Committee to lead it. Held that same year, I got a mix up here, okay. Held that same year, Atlanta's Cotton Exposition boasted a Negro Building and generally noteworthy fair. It was from its perch before a predominantly white audience that now Tuskegee University founder and preeminent Black leader Booker Taliaferro Washington gave his now famous Atlanta Compromise address. Quote, stressing the importance of hard work and gradual progress for Blacks, end quote, wrote Jacqueline M. Moore, author of Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, and the Struggle for Racial Uplift. He argued that they should, quote, cast down their buckets, end quote, where they were in agriculture rather than try to go off into politics and make friends with whites who could not help them, end quote. Now, if Washington had an ideological counterpart among Black Tennesseans, arguably no one would have embodied his spirit more than James Carroll Napier. A native Nashvillian, Napier had been educated in the city's pre-war Black clandestine schools before enrolling in Ohio's now Wilberforce University and then Oberlin College. Most importantly, however, was Napier's time as a student at Washington, D.C.'s Howard University Law School. There, he made an important connection with the law school's founding dean, James Mercer Langston, of whom, by the way, Langston Hughes is his namesake. Now, Langston had a daughter, Nettie, and James Carroll Napier would later marry Nettie in a very grand marriage. I think the wedding was actually called the occasion, the event of the year, that year. Napier served on the Nashville City Council between 1878 and 1886. And as the first Black to preside over it, he had been instrumental in the passage of most good reforms for Black Nashvillians throughout that time. A former Freedmen's Bureau agent, he fearlessly testified before Congress on Klan atrocities, held federal appointments, and was an entrepreneur and early leader in Washington's National Negro Business League. As such, Napier was a natural choice to head the Centennial's Negro Committee. But still, the matter of whether or not there would be a Negro building or merely Black exhibits was not nearly as easily resolved. If Robert W. Rydell's contention in All the World's Affair, that these public shows were defined by their planners' desire for, quote, racial dominance and economic growth, end quote, holds true, the South threw a wrench into their plans. The Black population of the South was simply too great to be summarily ignored. The 1884 World's Industrial and Cotton Centennial Exposition in New Orleans had proved that with its, quote, colored exhibit. The Atlanta Exposition had subsequently demonstrated that even more could be done with a separate and dedicated Negro building. And just as Atlanta had outdone New Orleans, Black Nashville was looking to outdo it. The Centennial's white planners were slow to acquiesce to this demand, leading to a very and increasingly frustrated Napier. In his letter of resignation to the executive committee in August 1896, Napier chided them. "We are confronted on every hand at home and abroad by the inquiry. If you are to have a department, why has not the plan for your building been accepted? Why has not the election of your building commenced?" The letter pointed to illness as the reason for his stepping down, but historian Bobby Lovett argues, and rightly so, that Napier resigned in protest of the executive committee's refusal to approve and move forward with plans for a Negro building. Now, the all-white executive committee, it seemed, didn't miss a beat, seizing the opportunity created by Napier's vacancy to appoint a person of their choosing. The white planners appointed Richard Hill to the Negro Department's directorship. Hill, a local public school teacher, was viewed by whites as an accommodationist due to familial ties and a dependence on a public salary. However, at the laying of the Negro Building's cornerstone on March 13, 1897, Hill stood before an overwhelmingly Black crowd of 10,000 triumphant. He declared, "We are now on trial, the most severe tests as to what we have done and are doing since our emancipation. We boast our enterprising spirit and progressivism. Our varied accomplishments have been proclaimed in flaming tones and painted in beautiful colors. Now is the time to prove all of this." Construction for the Centennial had begun the previous June, and the Negro Building was not likely to be completed before the following June, despite the celebration of the fair's opening on May 1st. Marking, as Don Doyle noted, quote, "the age of progress," end quote. Opening day visitors poured into the fair's buildings, attractions, exhibits, and amusement offerings. The prophecy of a promotional article in January 1897, the issue of the Scientific American, had come to pass. Quote, "By May 1st, the park will be all that a perfect climate, a fertile soil, and an artistic landscape can make it. In the great circle around the center lake is an imposing collection of monumental, though ephemeral, exhibition buildings. The ensemble is most imposing in front of a magnificent reproduction of the Parthenon, the noblest example of ancient architecture. It wasn't until June 5th that the Negro Building hosted its opening day. And the day's achievements did not belong alone to Hill, the Negro Committee's director, or even to his predecessor, James Carroll Napier. While the Exposition's executive committee was exclusively white, the Negro Department's leadership was owed to many of the city's leading Black citizens. Among the committee members were the lawyer and three-time Republican member of the Tennessee General Assembly, Samuel A. McElwee, businessman William A. T. Hightower, physicians William Abrams Hadley and Samuel A. Walker, school principal S.H. Sumner, and businessman and religious leader Preston Taylor. Added to them were the Negro Women's Board members and an army of Black skilled and semi-skilled tradespeople who contributed to constructing the Exposition's building and infrastructure. Now, nestled in Centennial Park on the western bank of that beautiful lake, the Tennessee Centennial Exposition's Negro Building stood as a mark of Black achievement and as a weapon of New South propaganda. The Centennial's neoclassical motif was also an ideal visual symbol of the New South, argued Christopher H. Coleman in his 1990 article for the Tennessee Historical Quarterly. Titled From Monument to Museum, Coleman claimed traditional Southern culture and values were adapting to a new age, the glory of Grecian enlightenment and culture, wedded to Roman engineering and technology, creating a new united republic. There was even a place in this brave new world for women and Blacks, he wrote, albeit in separate but equal facilities. Designed by white architect Frederick Thompson, who would later co-design Coney Island's Luna Park, the 20,000 square foot two-story structure was Spanish Renaissance in design. It cost about $13,000 to construct and featured handsome towers, a red roof, a rooftop pavilion, restaurant, and a medical facility with an all-Black staff to serve Black attendees. Now, if you look closely on that column, you can actually see the word Negro there on the inscripted on the outside. For Blacks in Nashville, the state of Tennessee, and the wider South, the picturesque building stood as a striking monument to Black possibility, characterized again by Herman Justy as imposing. The Negro Building featured Black art, culture, and science on proud display, although in a completely separate space. Separate was just another word for segregation, and it was enshrined in Plessy versus Ferguson. Even as New South boosters, the Exposition's all white executive committee planners could not resist the Exposition as an opportunity to reassert white Southern sovereignty over the region's race matters. Just as, quote, the colonial experience of the United States exported the justification of racial repression prevalent in the South in the 1890s across the oceans, observed Richard A. Kudo, the Negro Building of the Tennessee Centennial Exposition offered white Southerners an opportunity to explain the racial repression of African Americans in the South to white Northerners. Herman Justy historicized it this way: that the white and Black people of the South understand each other perfectly and do, if left to themselves, get along as perfectly and peaceably as any two races that ever dwelt together in any other country or in any other age, end quote. Even the Negro Building's opening day keynote speaker seemed to point to Black acquiescence to white rule. William Hooper Council Principal of the Agricultural and Mechanical College for Negroes at Alabama, now Alabama A&M University, remarked, "Teach obedience to law, obedience to legally constituted authority, which alone can give protection to life and property and security to society. Teach him that men and races grow from within, that congressional enactments cannot make us a race. The race must make itself." The clearly accommodationist nature of these directives preceded counsel's more insurgent ones. Teach him that he belongs to a glorious race, which stands before its gods with its hands unstained by human blood. Teach him that it is better to be persecuted than to persecute. Teach him that man, that race is superior, which does superior things to lift mankind to superior conditions. Teach him that it is the superior man of the superior race, which does the most for its country, fights most nobly for man, and lives closest to God. Now, were some of counsel's remarks problematic? Yes. But counsel and men and women like him fought enemies that our 21st century realities cannot fathom. To even have a Negro building was a feat. To have much more led an institution dedicated to the education of Black people was likewise a feat. Much of what might be characterized as docile was actually a matter of survival. Black people of this era were killed for much less with impunity. This is why no one likely bat an eye to the mixed commentary of Centennial Company President J.W. Thomas, for whom there's a statue still on the grounds. Quote, "If you follow the advice which the orators have given you, you will make more material progress in the next 5 years than you have made in the last 30. I address you as fellow citizens, for though the colored race may have a different complexion and differ in intellectual attainments from the white race, we are still fellow citizens of one great nation under one flag. As president of the Centennial Company, I welcome you to these grounds and to the Exposition. It is as much yours as ours," end quote. But was it really? Richard A. Kudo concluded that the Centennial's Negro Building, quote, "indicated the triumph of Washington's Tuskegee Creed," end quote. Conversely, Margaret Pearson concluded, quote, "the promise of these buildings was never fulfilled. They simply became another version of segregation, this time with the added concept of white benevolent paternalism," end quote. Historian Bobby Lovett landed somewhere in between the two. He described the way these racial, quote, "realities played out as racial accommodationism. White people who largely wanted to give nothing settled on paternalistic allowances of conditional Black self-determination, and Black people who rightly deserved equality and equity viewed the Centennial segregation of them to the Negro Building as a better opportunity than any had had before it, and seized that opportunity to show themselves and white onlookers that they were capable of extraordinary achievement. In the 3 decades then since the Civil War, Black Tennesseans generally and Black Nashvillians specifically, despite the persistence of terroristic racism and white supremacy, had made great strides in many fields of endeavor. Black higher education was among the most remarkable of their achievements, as Nashville was home again to 3 of the nation's most respected Black colleges. With over 300 exhibitors from 85 states, the Negro Building of the Tennessee Centennial offered diverse displays ranging from education to art and banking, technology and science. But The celebration of its construction was widespread but not universal. Some Black Tennesseans called for a boycott of the Tennessee Centennial, but Hill and other enthusiasts focused on the exhibition's good. In addition to supposedly not being rabidly segregated, they touted the exposition's calendar of special days for Black patrons. Negro Day, for example, drew more than 19,000 visitors, and others including Fisk University Day, Negro Employees Day, Central Tennessee College Day, Alumni Meharry College Day, National Race Council Day, Emancipation Day, and American Medical Association of Colored Physicians Day were leveraged as efforts to honor the, quote, free, educated, and aspiring new Negro, end quote. When the exhibition closed on October 30th, 1897, African Americans had won 31 certificates of commendation, 3 gold medals, 5 silver medals, and 19 bronze medals. Today, like most of its counterparts, the Negro Building is sadly no more. Its cornerstone is usually on display in the John Hope and Aurelia E. Franklin Library at Fisk University, but now is under loan for this exhibition special to the Parthenon. Its fate was a striking contrast to the fate of the Parthenon. Centennial cheerleader Tully Brown challenged, "Who will be the man that will strike the first blow of the Parthenon?" Led to a markedly different fate for similar structures in other expositions of this era. But for the Negro Building, and for the men, the Black men, and the Black women who helped to build it, this story stands as an enduring monument to Black Tennesseans and to their remarkable and enterprising acumen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. deGregory, for your fantastic words about the Negro Building at the Tennessee Centennial Exposition. We'll continue this discussion with some questions from the audience. So if anyone is listening and would like to ask a question of Dr. deGregory, please take a moment to add your questions into the Q&A and or the chat as well. And I'll be sure to read them out loud so all can see them and hear them. I, of course, have a million questions myself, but I will do my best to prioritize any listener questions. So let's give it just a minute if anyone would like to.
You could go ahead and then we'll give them some time to chime in.
Okay, I would love to start.
Chat,
so.
That's all we're doing. We're just chatting. I mean, it's being recorded, but we're just chatting.
Yeah. So one thing that really struck me as someone, you know, the person in charge of education at the Parthenon, I always try to set the tone of what life was like in the late 1800s. And your discussion of the landscape, the post-war landscape, and helping us envision the city was incredibly helpful for me. And I think is something that is good to put in context of how this exposition bubbles up and starts from a desolate city and a city that needs some change. But I also found it very interesting of all the different juxtapositions and the words and flowery language and the reality and how those things are sometimes stories apart. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that difference and what we sometimes read and see and what the reality was? And are there ways that we can learn how to close that gap and explain it kind of in context further? And that's a big question. So
no, it's a great question. And I, as a historian, of course, it's a question that I love because I think that context informs everything. You know, we have a way of, preferring to jump right into it. And oftentimes that doesn't give people enough perspective to even process what it is they're hearing relative to the subject matter. And okay, I would like to say in another generation, but this current generation, they don't know what slavery was unless you tell them. They have no clue. They don't even know what a cassette tape was. Okay, some of them don't know what a VHS player was, or a DVD player. Certainly, my grandma had one of the phones. You put your finger in and you did it around, and it come back, and do it around, and it come back. I mean, some of these kids don't know about like phones, like the handheld phone. They don't know about a phone, much less when these have the brick cell phones and they take it out the back pocket and they were all gray or black and, that have the antenna reaching out. They know nothing about that. And in a lot of ways, we know some about the past. I would tend to think and again, this could not be fair, but I do tend to think that there seemed to be more overlap generationally up to our generation than with subsequent generations. I think it's because they have so many more outlets for programming and for entertainment that they, for example, don't all, watch the same program with their parents and with their teachers as we did. I could go into a room and talk about chairs or Laura Ingalls Wilder, what I'm saying? Something like that when I first started teaching 20 years ago. If I do that now, crickets, nobody, they don't know who I'm talking about, and I don't know who they talking about either. The disconnect is great. So I tend to think that we take it for granted that we know what it was like. And I think, the way in which the politics plays out with Booker T. Washington as a juxtaposition to W.B. Du Bois. I'm a Fiskite, he's a Fiskite, it's an easy thing. But I don't like it. I don't like it at all because Booker T. Washington and Du Bois had very different realities. Booker T. Washington has raised a school out of the Alabama clay. Du Bois is largely on someone's payroll. I mean, he operates in the mind, and it's a wonderful thing to be in one's mind, and it gives you something to aspire to, and it's very lofty and very wonderful. But Booker T. Washington is paying people salaries, people who are supporting families, people who are sending their children to either his institution or other institutions. And so, he walks a finer line than Du Bois does. And I think the same is true of that generation in comparison to ours. Everything that people say now, they don't mean, and everything that people said then, they didn't mean. Some of it they said is a matter of survival. So when you see Black leaders get up and, say things that you think is docile or, what we call quote unquote Uncle Tom, and Uncle Tom had a role. And it's not as simple as, other people were revolutionaries and he was not. These are very complicated spaces that people are navigating, and we have to give people credit for that. I think in this particular time, white boosters are really in their own minds. And again, they're boosting, they're marketing. They don't have to believe any of what they say in order to say it. It just has to sound good and look good and attract good things to them. I mean, that is their preoccupation. And I think when you hold all things in balance, all things in tension, and you look for the gray matter, which is really, really hard with something like slavery. You absolutely don't want to say it was absolutely terrible. There was absolutely nothing about it, but Black people had lives. They lived, they loved, they danced, they laughed, they bore children. That's a hopefulness that they are projecting forward to us. And in the same way, we have that responsibility. We have responsibility to interrogate our words and the words of others, to think deeply about them, to draw our own conclusions, and to give a good measure of grace sometimes in places where we don't. I think Of course, there's a lot of conversation around cancel culture and things of that nature. And, in some instances, it's very much valid. Like people just, we need to say, you know what, we've had enough. Now you can go ahead and live the rest of your life, work the rest of it out. They would send people who did particularly offensive things in ancient times on pilgrimages for the rest of their life to go and figure it out. And that's what we're doing to some people. You go and figure it out. You don't got to die, but I just don't want to see you figuring it out. And then in other instances, some things can be hashed out via conversation because, none of us gets it all right. And I like to say that each of us has some privilege, whether it's race privilege or heteronormative privilege, religious privilege, literate privilege, college educated privilege, air conditioned privilege right now. That's a big privilege. I assure you, I got, everybody got their air set to 70 something and every fan in their house is blowing. There are some people for whom that is not an option. So that is a kind of privilege. And so it's not always popular. It's not always easy, but I do believe it's worth it to always interrogate both ourselves and others in the contemporary period and also in the historic period as well.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing more words and helping us work through some of those massive disparities. Yeah. We do have a couple questions in the chat. I will ask those before taking another turn myself. We have a question from Candy Toller. She asks, were Blacks permitted to attend the Centennial every day?
It seemed as though they were. It seems as though they were free to roam. Again, segregation is a slippery thing. It is rigid where the person enforcing the line makes it rigid, and it's porous where the person enforcing the line moves it, right? And so did everyone have a great experience? Every Black person had a great experience at the Tennessee Centennial? Absolutely not. There are some reports of, people encountering trouble in their travels into Tennessee, Jim Crow seating and things of that nature. So in large part, I think that the historic record says that it was conditionally and kind of loosely segregated. But again, the experiences that Black people could have with white people in desegregated situations was not always a safe one. In fact, if I had had more time, I could have and would have talked about the ways in which the Tennessee Centennial kind of created indicators for the future of Blacks in public parks in Nashville. And I can tell you that largely Black people had come away with saying, we'd like our own park. You could have your park, we could have our, because then we could be safe in our own park. We can police our own park, and we don't have to constantly navigate what it means to be reduced to second-class citizenship in America. Even in a park, we just like to be in a park. We just like to ride the rides, okay? We just like to eat our food and, crack our jokes and do whatever it is we want to do. And that didn't work out that way. In fact, some of you may know that Hadley Park is the first public park for Blacks in the nation, but it was policed by a white officer. And so Black Nashvillians complained about that to no avail. But yes, I would say that it was about as loosely segregated as one could expect for that time. But I can assure you that Black people had encounters with white people during that exposition that were unpleasant at best, if not terribly worse in other ways.
Thank you. The next question is from Jennifer Richardson, and she asks, so little remains from the Negro Building and the exhibits inside. What do you wish we knew, And what questions do you have that haven't been answered by what survives?
I just wish the building stood, Okay, so coming from the Caribbean, I could not fathom building all these buildings and tearing them all down. I mean, that just makes no sense. I mean, who does that? I mean, they did regularly. It just made sense to them at the time. I really, really wish the building stood. I really, really, really wish the building stood. In terms of the I wish we had more firsthand recollections from Black people, kind of away from the official history record, because I think there we would get a more honest telling of their experiences, of their frustrations. All of those things I think would be more apparent if, let's just say, for example, and then again, it's not a perfect example, but let's just say, for example, they were writing in a kind of oral history project at Fisk or something like that. And mind you, they'd still be censored, because we always are always conscious, well, those of us who are responsible, of the ways in which our words can be used and also can be used against us. But I think if we'd had records like that, that surely would have given us more of a clearer view into what Black people experienced and how they felt about those experiences.
Yeah, there's so many. One of the most common questions we get beyond why is this here is where did everything else go? And
right.
I think, yeah, having the structure as a monument, as you say, to the work and advocacy of the time would be a phenomenal resource to have.
I don't think a lot of people understand that the Parthenon also was slated for demolition, not just at that time, but lots of times subsequent to it. And so it barely survived by the skin of its teeth and by virtue of people who really took up its cause. And so if you just juxtapose with how difficult it was to save the Parthenon with trying to save a Negro building, who was going to do that? And who was going to do that successfully for such a long period of time before there was not just renewed interest, but resources to match that renewed interest?
Our next question comes from D. Dillard, who asks, how do we make sure history such as this is not pushed aside given today's attempts to not acknowledge it?
Yeah, it's really hard. I think that we have to be nosy to good effect. I think lots of us are nosy, but we're not nosy by things that make us uncomfortable. So I think for a lot of people just hearing Negro building, they're like, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to hear that. They have lots of presumptions about what that might mean. The truth is, here's the truth. A lot of people are tired, but I can assure you, Black people are exhausted. And most of us don't want to hear about no terrible history. It is just too much. We are just inundated on every side. The pandemic, now the monkeypox, gasoline prices through the roof. Every other day, a Black person is, an unarmed Black person is killed. And that's on top of the regular things, like the regular illness and health challenges and deaths and actual civilian on civilian crime. So we're tired. We're tired. And so I think a lot of it's twofold. We have to have the responsibility of the public who supports programs such as this, because if you don't show up, then there is really no leverage with which an education director can go back to a director and say, this was a worthwhile program. No matter if it's right, no matter if it's just. We're talking about bottom line here. People want value for their money, especially people who are donating their money. And so, there has to be a natural inquisitiveness and a willingness for people to learn about things that they perhaps don't know about. I think lots more people would have enjoyed this talk because they see the park and they don't really know anything. I didn't. I used to walk the park all the time. I now walk by Centennial Mall, but it's good to know. It's actually very interesting. But I think too, the responsibility is on the hosts and the planners to really, I said this a couple of years ago at a talk at Fort Negley, and they're like, where are all the young people? I'm like, it's Saturday or whatever time it was. I was like, they're at brunch. They're drinking like bottomless mimosas. Like, we have to find a way to create events that appeal to people's interests, or at least intersects those circles. And so I might have an interest in mimosas, but or not. I might have an interest in cigars or not. But it's very rare that you're just going to find purists or just interested in history. You have to kind of bundle it. It's like a cell phone company. They want to offer you cell phone, land phone, cable, eternal life if they could sell it, and so we have to do our very best to communicate to the public these heavy or substantive things in ways that are also fun and exciting, and make them want to engage and make them want to be present at 7:00 on a Thursday before a long weekend.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. We do have one more question in the chat. So again, or in the Q&A, if anyone has additional questions, now is the last call to submit them before we adjourn for the evening. So the next question is from Paris Robertson, and she asks, was the Negro Building meant as a space for only Black people at the Centennial Exposition?
No. Loosely. Again, white people could move the line of segregation. And so it was primarily for Black attendees. But if white people had an interest, this was one time that they could come and not be called a racist diatribe themselves, like quote, N lover. As the early missionaries, northern white missionaries were called at Fisk and other places like that, and rocks thrown at them and whatever, because at that point, the white South did not want whites crossing that line to provide Black education. But in this instance, I think the white South was happy because they did not offer the Negro Building or these exhibits as a testament to Negroes. They ordered these things and allowed them as a testament to themselves. They were demonstrating how good they were. They were demonstrating how progressive they were. They were demonstrating how genteel and wonderful Southern life could be across racial lines. And so if they had an interest, they could explore it. But again, in terms of the services provided, medical services, food services, all those things would have been segregated. So I don't think white people could have rolled up into the Negro Building restaurant and ordered a burger. Now, I don't want to say they tasted better there, but I'm sure they tasted real good. It was real moist over there. I'm telling you, because, we spent a lot of time learning how to cook and cook well. Some through interest and others through force of servitude. So I think it's always good for us to remember that sometimes history is nonsensical. Sometimes what we would presume would be the truth, given racial realities, is not. Like if you had asked me when I was a freshman in college or something like that, like where did they put the Black soldiers in the Civil War? I would have said the front lines, because so they can get shot. But that history just doesn't bear that out as true. It just wasn't true. And you weren't even given the dignity of dying on the front lines. So history is, as I tell people, probably more interesting than fiction. It is more salacious. It's more tricky. You got people doing things that, you wouldn't have thought, in places they should not be. And, for that reason, I encourage people while, we do have a tendency to get attached to public fables, that history is in fact far more interesting than any fable that we could create in order to command interest from the public. So it just has really been my pleasure, just personally, to learn more about a subject matter that I knew a little bit about, because I stop and read every sign, which is very annoying to people who travel with me. Every historical mark. I'm like, hold on one second, stop the car. Okay, you don't have to stop. Just let me take a picture. I'll read it on my phone later. But even acts as simple as that help to grow one's knowledge of historical subject matter, and also give you a length and breadth and a context for which you learn and think about contemporary ideas.
We do have another question pop up, one in the question and answer and one in the chat. And I think they're similar, but I will ask them separately just to make sure we have both of them addressed. I'll start with the one in the chat, which is from, I just thought Terrence Gilbert, who asks, how do we get more involved in the work when we have no buildings and limited records, etc.?
Yeah, that's very hard. The trick is to begin with what you have. There's a tendency in history for doors to be opened when you put your foot in them. And so when you start digging, you're like, oh, I didn't realize there was a connection there. There's a tendency for those that, especially in this period that we're talking about, the world is so small. It is so small. I mean, everybody knows everybody. If we are 7 degrees removed from each other at this point, they were like 0.7 removed from each other at the time. If you didn't know someone's mother, sister, whatever, it just, especially when you talk about educated people of this time, we have to remember that a college educated populace, even now, is a rarity. I mean, it feels like college debt is commonplace, but it's still very rare. And so if you take it back 125 years, there are only so many white men moving in powerful circles. I mean, although whiteness and white supremacy would have you believe otherwise, the vast majority of white Southerners and white Americans, period, were poor. And in some instances, in no better position than their Black American counterparts. But when you think of men like Du Bois and Booker T and Council, it has to be a small circle. It's just no way. I mean, I know college presidents today, Black college presidents today. And so at that time, of course, they all knew each other. And that's why I tell people too, that sometimes you don't know the whole story. Du Bois's and Booker T's beef, I don't know the whole story. I do know that a part of what we don't think about with them both is they were men competing for one perch. Those two men is never gonna get along. And I tell people, you say, oh, Du Bois said, the 10% should go to college and whatever. I say, yeah. And Booker T said the vast majority of Black people, they ain't going to college. So you should master a skill, because that's what's gonna give you a life. Well, 10% from 100 leaves like 90%. So, I mean, basically these two brothers are saying the same thing. They just arguing different sides of the coin to different publics who would receive them differently. And I don't know. I mean, this could be over a woman. This could be over a scuff on their shoe. I don't know what's going on, but I don't presume that I know everything. And I think that's helpful, that when you start researching, don't presume that this is all you will find. Start and see where it takes you. And it may take you very far.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Our final question, I think, is a very strong question and along sort of the same thread. It's from D'Anthony Reed, who asks, going forward, in what ways would you suggest we preserve Black buildings and institutions as well as spaces?
Yeah, that's a hard question because the juxtaposition to that is white buildings and white spaces. Okay, so here's a harsh truth. I don't know whether it's going to be history will prove me wrong or right on this, but here I am. I remember when I was in graduate school at Vanderbilt, there was a debate over Confederate Hall and should they call it something else. And I was of the opinion, as some historians are, and like I said, 10 years ago when I wrote my dissertation, we were lowercasing Blacks, and today we uppercase it. So things change. But I told them to keep it there. I don't want you to call it something else. You accepted their money. They built the building. And certainly I don't want you to strike it off the building. I want you to keep it there. I said, and I'm thinking to myself, if you're going to rename Confederate Hall, you're going to rename Vanderbilt University. I'm trying to think like, how far is justice going to take us, But I do think in a lot of instances where there is perpetual harm, that monuments, although I think of them fondly because I'm a historian, particularly those that we know serve purposes that were not good, were not just, we ought to put them in appropriate places of memorialization, like museums or like a park that serves as a memorial park to former Confederate structures built as propaganda for the Confederacy long after it fell. With Black buildings and institutions and histories, it's really hard because we are in so many instances so fragile that you want to say, well, just give all of your things to this school or to this library. And I'm certain that the good folks at the John Hope and Aurelia E. Franklin Library, where I spent so much time and where I received so much help in writing this tonight's presentation, would say, yeah, send it to us. And I think it's a good thing, but it's so tenuous. But because you just don't know if white supremacy will have the last laugh, But I will say this. We are called to be less brave today than someone like Napier, than someone like Richard Hill, than someone like Anna Julia Cooper, than someone like Ida B. Wells. I mean, these people work and they labored and they built and they grew trees whose shade they never enjoyed. And so I think it's up to us to work in faith and in hope that what we have done will matter and will endure, even though we know that it is constantly under duress and attack. And so that means doing our level best to support Black storytellers, doing the good work of D and I long before it was fashionable. We have to give them places and spaces at the table. We have to pay them equitably because people got lives and bills and they need money just like everyone else. We have to support them financially. In instances where we don't have a lot, we can give a little, but we can also give of ourselves. We can volunteer. And one of the ways in which to really affect positive change in large, predominantly white storytelling spaces is to be present as a Black face in those spaces and say, hey, wait a minute. No, I'll never forget this story, and then I'll close because I know everybody's ready to go. But I'll never forget, I went to Jack Daniel's distillery a couple of years ago. And the docent was wonderful. I mean, listen to me. This woman, woo-wee! I don't know if she worked that job all her life, but it seemed that way. I mean, it seemed like she was Jackie Daniels because she knew everything. It was just rolling on. It was just wonderful. So as we're walking through the structure and we see the place where Jack sat at the table and whatever, and I was traveling with my cousin and aunt and uncle, and I turned to my cousin, I said, something ain't right about this story. And she said, what you mean? I said, something ain't right. I said, where are the Black people? I said, there are no Black people. I said, how are there no Black people? In a story in the South? I said, it's not possible. I said, something ain't right. I said, now I'm not going to be that Black person because you know I can be. I said, I'm not going to do that today. I said, but I'm telling you, there's more to this story. I don't know what it is, but there got to be Black people in this story. There's no story in the South that's exclusively white. It don't exist. I said, and work too, hard work. I know these white people wasn't doing all this work by themselves. So we walked some more. I said, again, I'm just going to sip the, I don't want the cinnamon. I don't want that. I'll drink this other one. It's good. Maybe one. How much is a barrel of Select? Oh, 3,500. One day when I make it, I'll get one from y'all. Okay. I turned to my cousin. I said, now something not right about the story now. I said, now I'm not, because we were the only Black people on the tour. I said, I'm not going to bother. About 3 weeks later, I opened my phone to find I think, New York Times article that says, Uncle Nearest. It says Nearest, it says Jack Daniels story, kind of incomplete. Nearest Green is the true brewmaster or something like that. And I said, see, I told you someone right about that story. And do you know, since then, I've had the pleasure of a behind the scenes tour at Uncle Nearest Distillery. And I spoke with the CEO, who in fact was the person who broke the story nationally. But do you know those people knew that story all that time? All of those people in that community, Black and white, knew the truth, but they allowed Jack Daniels Distillery to sell a lie that Jack had gone to a preacher, and the preacher had, I said, the preacher? No, it wasn't the preacher. It was the preacher's enslaved person. Okay. And I think that's the difference that having diversity at the table brings. I can't just be about, I can't go and knock down the door and say to the Parthenon or the Centennial Park, hey, you should have me speak. I guess I could, but I don't know if that would go to great effect. But these institutions, virtually lily white, have a responsibility to say, you know what, we have a deficiency in this area, and we should reach out to an expert in the subject matter to help us. Or we have really good docents, but we don't have anybody other than old white people. We got to get some young people. We have to get some differently abled people. We have to get some Black people, some Spanish speaking people. We got an Arabic population here, some Arabic. We got to do something. And so I think it's not either or, it's both. Institutions have a responsibility to be receptive, to be seeking, to constantly be pushing, to constantly be evolving. And people who have not been traditionally afforded a seat at the table have responsibility to be receptive and responsive to invitations, but also to push back. I mean, if something is wrong, you're not there to turn a blind eye to it being wrong. It's unfortunately your responsibility to say, hey, did you test that in the market? Because that's not going to work. I mean, Black people are not going to like that. They're not going to like that one bit. Like you can't say that and expect Black people to come to your thing, because they're not coming. But so, it's a two-way street. But ultimately, Black institutions and Black people for the longest time in this nation's history have been the best demonstrations of what racial cooperation could achieve. And I think for that reason, they ought to receive more credit and more support and more confidence. And we have to have more hope and more faith, just as so many of those fighting on the right side of history generations before us did, so that we could have the time and the space and the privileges that we enjoy.
I
That's it.
could not, I could not think of a stronger exit call to action to get involved. So I am simply going to echo the messages I've been receiving in the chat and at large that express dear thanks to you for sharing your research and your expertise with an audience I know personally have learned so much about a complex, to say the least, period of history, but it is our Tennessee history. It's something that we love to talk about at the Parthenon, and the history is not a closed book, right? So we're always learning more about the past. And I hope you can see the messages in the chat that express their thanks to you for sharing your work tonight. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I would also like to thank our sponsors who have worked to support the exhibition. It's called Looking Back, 125 Years After the Tennessee Centennial Exposition. The sponsors include the Sandra Schotten Foundation, the Tennessee Arts Commission, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Memorial Foundation, Jackson, Humanities Tennessee, Metro Parks, and Centennial Park Conservancy. Slight disclosure, the content of our exhibitions do not necessarily represent the views of our partners and underwriters. However, I think the message is something that is universal. And I am so grateful for your time tonight and sharing your work with us. So thank you everybody as well for joining, for submitting your questions. And I hope you can come see the work and see Dr. Crystal deGregory's words in the exhibit itself. So have a great night, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you too. Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you're the first to know about all the exciting things happening at the Nashville Parthenon.